Singapore is often called a housing miracle. Located on a small island with almost no natural resources, the government built a system where 9 in 10 citizens own their own home. That number alone puts Singapore among the highest home ownership rates in the world, far exceeding countries very many times richer. This is the story of how it happened, not by accident, but through decades of deliberate intervention. Why was intervention necessary? In the late 1950s, Singapore was a city in crisis. Most people lived in overcrowded slums and kampongs. These are informal wooden settlements with no sanitation, no fire safety, and rents that kept rising. The colonial era Singapore Improvement Trust had built only about 24,000 homes in over 3 decades. That's nowhere near enough for a fast-growing population. Government intervention was not a policy preference. No. It was a response to a housing emergency that private markets had failed to solve. When the People's Action Party came to power in Singapore and the country moved towards self-governance and then full independence in 1965, housing became a matter of national survival, not just welfare. The newly formed Housing and Development Board, the HDB, was established in 1960 to replace the failing colonial housing trust. Leaders like Lee Kuan Yew treated homeownership as a national building tool. The idea was that a citizen who owned a stake in their home would have a stake in the country itself. That philosophy, housing as a social contract, not just shelter, shaped every decision that followed. To house people at the scale and speed required, HDB couldn't rely on traditional brick-by-brick construction. It turned to prefabrication, building standardized concrete components off-site in factories, then assembling them on-site like large-scale building blocks. Think Legos. Today, precast components make up roughly 70% of the typical HDB building's structure. And newer methods go even further. Prefabricated, pre-finished, volumetric construction, or PPVC, manufactures entire room modules, walls, floors, ceilings, and even finished bathrooms in a factory. Then trucks and cranes pull and put them in place. This is what lets Singapore build tens of thousands of flats a year without sacrificing consistency and speed. 2 kinds of crises accelerated the housing system. The first was a fire on 25th May 1961, a massive fire that tore through the Bukit Ho Swee Kampong, killing 4 people and injuring 54. And leaving roughly 16,000 people homeless overnight. It remains the worst fire in Singapore's history. The government's swift, large-scale response was resettling the fire victims into new HDB flats within months. This response became a defining proof of concept for public housing at scale and gave the young government political momentum to expand the program aggressively. The second kind of crisis was racial violence. Singapore experienced serious communal riots in the 1960s, born out of ethnic tensions between communities living in separate, self-segregated enclaves. These events convinced leaders that housing policy had to do more than just shelter people. It had to actively integrate them, or risk repeating the divisions of the past. Thus, between the fires and the unrest, a structural problem was exposed. The government did not control enough land to rebuild the city to the scale needed. In 1966, Parliament passed the Land Acquisition Act, giving the state sweeping powers to compulsorily acquire private land for public development at controlled below-market compensation. This was the single most important legal reform behind Singapore's housing transformation. It freed up land that let HDB clear kampongs and build entire new towns, and it remains one of the most powerful state land acquisition regimes in the world. By the late 1980s, a new problem had emerged. As HDB flats entered a growing resale market, families increasingly bought homes near others of their own ethnicity, recreating the very racial enclaves the government had spent decades dismantling. Estates like Bedok and Tampines, Malay households exceeded 30% of the population. In Hugang, Chinese households exceeded 90%. On February 16, 1989, the ministry introduced the ethnic integration policy to Parliament, and it took effect on 1st March 1989. The policy set hard quotas, roughly matching national demographics, capping how many flats in any block or neighborhood could be owned by any one ethnic group. Once a quota is reached, no more sales to that group are allowed in that block, unless it's a resale between members of the same group. It was and still is one of the most direct uses of housing policy to engineer social integration anywhere in the world. The result of 6 decades of this policy machinery. As of 2024, Singapore's resident home ownership rate stands at 90.8%, according to Singapore Department of Statistics. 78% of Singapore residents live in HDB flats, and roughly 90% of households own rather than rent their unit, enabled heavily by the Central Provident Fund, a compulsory savings scheme that lets citizens use retirement savings towards home purchase. Compare that to the United States, where the home ownership rate sat at about 65% in the late 2025 and early 2026, a level that has barely moved in a quarter century and remains below its 2004 peak of 69%. Or even compare it to the wider European Union, where ownership averaged around 69% as of 2022. Singapore's rate isn't just higher, it's in a different tier entirely. Closer to that of Laos and Romania, 2 of the very few countries that also exceed 90% home ownership rates. Singapore's story shows what's possible when a government treats housing not as a private commodity, but as a public infrastructure, backed by land reform, industrialized construction, and deliberate social policy. It didn't happen by chance. It happened because a crisis, fires, riots, chronic shortage was met with decades of consistent, sometimes controversial, but always deliberate intervention. So, what lessons can Africa learn from Singapore's housing solution? Singapore solved its housing crisis in a single generation. Africa is now facing a housing crisis of its own, arguably a bigger one. So the question worth asking is simple. What exactly can Africa borrow from Singapore's playbook? And what won't translate at all? Let's start with the scale of the problem. Africa's cities are growing faster than any other city on earth. The continent gains roughly 40,000 new urban residents every single day. Across the continent, the housing shortfalls Nigeria alone facing a gap of about 28 over 51 million homes. In sub-Saharan Africa, well over half of urban households already spend more than 40% of their income on shelter. This is not a distant problem. It is today's problem, moving faster than governments can respond to it. So what does Singapore actually offer? Lesson 1, land control has to come before housing delivery. Singapore's transformation wasn't primarily a construction story, no. It was a land story. In 1966, Land Acquisition Act gave the state power to assemble land at scale, which is what made the mass building possible in the first place. Across much of Africa, the opposite problem exists. Land tenure is fragmented, often informal, sometimes contested between customary and statutory systems, and the registries are incomplete or unreliable. Before any country can build at Singapore's pace, it needs functioning land administration, clear title, reliable registries, and a legal mechanism to assemble land for public housing without triggering years of litigation. This is less glamorous than tower blocks, but it's the actual foundation everything else sits on. Number 2, industrialized construction beats artisanal building at scale. Singapore didn't outbuild its housing gap with bricklayers, no. It did it with precast concrete components and more recently, prefabricated volumetric modules built in factories and assembled on site. Several African governments and developers in Rwanda, Kenya, and parts of West Africa have begun piloting similar approaches. But the bigger lesson isn't the specific technology, it's the principle. As long as the housing is built one artisanal project at a time, financed project by project, African cities will never build fast enough to catch up with the demand. Standardization and off-site manufacturing is what let Singapore build tens of thousands of units a year without corresponding explosion in cost or delay. Lesson 3. Forced structured savings can substitute for weak mortgage markets. This is arguably Singapore's most transferable innovation. The Central Provident Fund lets citizens direct a proportion of their compulsory retirement savings toward a home purchase, effectively turning pension savings into a housing finance engine. Most African housing markets don't have that luxury. Mortgage penetration across the continent remains extremely low, and formal mortgage debt is often under 5% of GDP outside of South Africa. Yeah, let that sink for a moment. But the underlying idea is using existing pension and provident fund pools as a housing finance lever, rather than waiting for mortgage markets to mature organically. This is exactly the kind of structural innovation that's still largely untapped in Africa. It's also, not coincidentally, the space that real estate investment trusts are starting to occupy, which brings us up to REITs. Africa's REIT market is still very tiny and lopsided, worth about $30 billion continent-wide, with South Africa alone accounting for more than 95% of that. But it is growing, and Nigeria's REIT sector nearly doubled its assets through 2025, driven partly by a new government-backed real estate fund. REITs won't replace state-led housing delivery the way Singapore HDB does. Singapore model is fundamentally public and non-market in its core, but REITs can do something Singapore never really needed: mobilize pension and institutional capital into rental and affordable housing stock in markets where home ownership isn't yet realistic for most households. In other words, where Singapore leaned entirely on ownership, parts of Africa may need to lean harder on well-structured rental housing finance first. Lesson 4. Political will has to survive multiple electoral leadership cycles. Singapore's housing program worked because it wasn't treated as one government's pet project. It was institutionalized, funded consistently, and protected from being reversed with each change in leadership. Many African housing programs have suffered the opposite fate: strong starts followed by funding collapse or abandonment when political priorities shift. Institutional continuity, housing agencies insulated from short-term political cycles may be a harder lesson to import than any construction technique, but it may also be the most important one. And a caution, Singapore is a city-state of about 6 million people, an unusually centralized, unusually well-resourced government. African countries are managing housing policy across dozens of cities, weaker fiscal bases, and far more complex land histories, including the legacies of the colonial and apartheid eras. Land dispossession that Singapore did not have to contend with in that way. Singapore's ethnic integration policy, for instance, only works because the state already controls the vast majority of housing stock. Trying to impose a similar truth on Africa, when Africa's much smaller public housing stock and much larger private and informal sectors simply wouldn't have the same leverage. So, the honest takeaway isn't copy Singapore. It's this: land reform first, industrialized construction second, and innovative capital mobilization through pension funds and real estate investment trusts as the financial engine that replaces what Singapore did with forced savings. Different tools, same underlying discipline. Treat housing as infrastructure, not as a commodity to be left to the market alone. Until the next one, thank you for sticking with us.